So start this debate. The audience also be quiet between the speakers as well. I'd like to invite the Prime Minister over to debate, please.
Pleasant morning to everyone in today's debate. The recent Mumbai attacks, Mr. Speaker, brought renewed focus on Lashkar-e-Taiba, a Palestinian separatist group that originated in the mid-1990s as the militant arm of Markaz Dawatul Ishad, a group of dominantly Punjabs, Mr. Speaker, seeking for an independent Kashmir. The group first made, Mr. Speaker, its existence known in the early 1990s when it attacked the bases in Bandiapura of the United States. And soon after that, Mr. Speaker, a lot of actors in the international community began to discern the dangers that the group poses to everyone concerned, especially in the Kashmir region. The debate that we want to forward coming from First Government in today's debate is going to be particularly clear. Basically, Mr. Speaker, we say that if you look at international standards of when force can be used by certain states in retaliation, we think that in fact the circumstances surrounding the Mumbai attacks merit that particular response. Which is why we say, coming from First Affirmative, that what we want to do is for India to bomb certain terrorist bases in Pakistan, and the selection of these bases will rely heavily on intelligence consolidated by other external actors such as the European Union, for example, and the United States, in order for us to make sure that the areas that we will be targeting are in fact those that everyone agrees on are bases of this particular group. So what I want to do for you in today's debate, Mr. Speaker, are two things. The first thing I want to do is look at the history of this particular terrorist organization and why we say that the unique nuances of that particular group merit this certain response. And secondly, I want to look at certain criteria in the international community and why we think that the circumstances surrounding the Mumbai attacks, Mr. Speaker, merit this form of retaliation. First argument then, coming from Prime Minister, is this: how if you look at international standards that surround the ability of certain states to retaliate, Mr. Speaker, against terrorist attacks, we think the circumstances surrounding the Mumbai attacks merit in fact that particular response. But before I move on to my constructive slides, yes sir?
Madam, was Sadari already weak? Do you worry about an ISI takeover in the wake of an attack?
Mr. Speaker, that's something I'm going to factor in my first argumentation when I'm going to look at all the external actors that could possibly be involved in this particular issue. First, Mr. Speaker, what are the instances during which you allow for force to be used against another entity in the international community? If you look at the Constitution of the United Nations Security Council, we have what we call the Caroline criteria, which enlists three circumstances within which states are able to use force against another entity. And the three standards are as follows. First, if the threat is immediate and overwhelming, no thank you. And secondly, Mr. Speaker, if the strategy is to be done with respect to anticipatory self-defense. And we say that if we look at what happened in Mumbai, Mr. Speaker, all these standards are being fulfilled. Why? On the first level, if you look at the Mumbai attacks, Mr. Speaker, they were attacks that nobody ever anticipated. If you look at what happened to Mumbai, Mr. Speaker, everyone was overwhelmed by the amount and the extent of the damage that we saw after the attacks. And we say, Mr. Speaker, that if the repercussions are this grave, a response is necessary coming from the state. But moreover, Mr. Speaker, we say that Hafiz Zaid, the leader of this particular movement, has already declared that they will not, Mr. Speaker, stop the attacks unless they are able to dethrone the Indian government. Because if you look at the goal, Mr. Speaker, of Lashkar-e-Taiba, it has morphed throughout the years, because their initial goal was only to gain the independence of Kashmir. And this was something that India already granted them, which is why even if rightfully that territory belongs to India, they decided to cede control to the Pakistani government. So the initial goal of the group, Mr. Speaker, has already been achieved, which is why they've grown to be more unreasonable, because they were able to get that particular goal and achieve that particular goal. Now what they want to do is to destabilize the Indian government, because they feel out of extreme fundamentalist reasons that it is necessary for them to dethrone, Mr. Speaker, the leaders in Delhi and to be able to bring back Muslim influence in that particular country. So we say that if you look at what the Indian government has done and their trends of engagement with respect to that particular group, they've been very objective in that they negotiated with that group in the early 1990s, for example, and just recently they ceded control to Pakistan so that all these atrocities will halt. But instead of compromising, Mr. Speaker, and allowing for these trends to progress, what did Lashkar-e-Taiba do? Lashkar-e-Taiba, Mr. Speaker, decided that what they want to do is to in fact become more unreasonable and to ask for more from a government that already compromised with them. And we think that when the attack is this overwhelming, a response is necessary from the state. And in the case of anticipatory retaliatory self-defense, Hafiz Said has already said repeatedly that they will continue the attacks, that they will continue all these atrocities just so they get what they want. Which is why we say in this particular instance, it is necessary for the state to do something that sends a powerful message that says we will not tolerate everything that you've been doing in order to destabilize our state. No, thank you. But the second thing I want to talk to you about in today's debate, Mr. Speaker, is more on a pragmatic level. Because I want to talk about the kind of message that you send, essentially, when you allow for this form of response coming from the Indian government. We say, Mr. Speaker, that it is not enough to say that the Indian government has to do something. The primary question that we need to respond to in today's debate is, why is this the strategy that they should employ? Why should bombing these particular terrorist bases the strategy they should employ? And we have two reasons, Mr. Speaker, to outline in response to that. The first reason, Mr. Speaker, is basically this, that if you look at the way that Lashkar-e-Taiba has functioned, they've become emboldened throughout the years. This particular group is unique in that unlike other terrorist groups which go through periods of weakness, Mr. Speaker, Lashkar-e-Taiba has been strengthening through the past decade. And we think that's dangerous, which is why we say we have to attack them where it hurts the most. Because the terrorist bases are where they keep their armaments, for example, where they seat their army, Mr. Speaker, which allows them to destabilize the Indian government. Which is why we say the attack has to be strong and the attack has to be decisive. Because it is necessary for us to make sure that their functionality is decreased. It is necessary for us to make sure that their ability to wage destruction is ultimately decreased. Which is why we say the response coming from open government in today's debate is quite commensurate. Because we say that it is necessary for us to disempower their ability to wreak destruction even more. But moreover, we want to send a message that we will not tolerate the kind of tactics that you have been employing, Mr. Speaker, for you to be able to seize control and for the Indian government to respond to your unreasonable demands. We say at the end of the day that if you look at the trends of the atrocities committed by Lashkar-e-Taiba, it has been increasing, Mr. Speaker. It has been intensifying because they feel empowered. Because all the Indian government has done is try to negotiate with them, to try to deal with them, bargain with them, and in fact it has come to the extent that they ceded the Kashmir territory to this particular group. We say that when the level of unreasonability is like this, when it goes to the extent that the group is being empowered by the silence, Mr. Speaker, of the Indian government, or their failure to do anything decisive and strong, we think that a stronger response is necessary in order to curb all these atrocities. So essentially, what have I been discussing for the past few minutes? First, Mr. Speaker, I looked at the debate on a principled level. When I looked at the criteria existent in the international community and how we feel that the circumstances surrounding the Mumbai attack in fact merit the kind of response that we on First Affirmative want to forward in today's debate. But secondly, I looked at the debate on a pragmatic level by evaluating first the kind of message that we want to send in order to make sure that these things do not happen again. But second, we talked about the functionality of this particular terrorist group and why we say, Mr. Speaker, that it's necessary for us to aim where it hurts the most. For all these reasons, we think quite clearly Ateneo should take this debate.
7 minutes, 28 seconds. Thank you, Prime Minister. I invite you to the position of the case.
The opening government has made a case that relies on a fundamentally false and unproven assertion. And this assertion is that bombs stop terrorists. We see, in fact, that bombs create terrorists by the hundreds with a single blast, because when a bomb misses and hits, say, a house, those orphans grow up and learn what to do with the people that bombed them. The children of the terrorists that are killed grow up and see where they should follow in the footsteps of their parents. And the group itself is able to say, well, look, now it's not just a matter of us taking them out, it's a matter of self-defense. So we say, no, bombs don't stop terrorists. Bombs create terrorists. And until they show the link between bombing a base and getting the benefits that they want, we have to oppose this. And so this is why first I'm going to go through my refutation, then get to my 3 points, which is first, that this violates the sovereignty of Pakistan and the Kashmir region. 2, that it will spark an international war. And 3, which is my partner's extension, which is that this is going to destabilize the new Pakistani government. So, going to my first contention, that bombs don't stop the piece of refutation, rather. That bombs don't stop terrorists, they create them. And the empirical evidence is this is Israel. They've been doing this for years. In fact, in 2006, when they leveled Beirut in the sort of terrorist bombings and collective punishment that they're talking about, look at how Hezbollah was able to recover from this and actually got stronger, because this is how these groups get popular support. The Indian government bombs you, we build your house again. Now what do you want to do for us? Yes?
Can you please outline any kind of solution to the very pressing issue that the opening government's outlined today?
Well, that's what I'm going to get to. That's what I'm going to get to next. Is that that this is the problem with their model? Is they say, oh well, there's no other solution. But first of all, taking a particularly bad solution instead of nothing at all isn't very rational. But we think that India has taken a huge step. And this step is where their model completely fails. Is that India has already been roundly supported for its resolution that was passed, vowing to not use violence to resolve the Mumbai incident. And when they've already pledged before the entire international community that they're not going to do the exact thing that they're telling the Indian government to do, then where is the international and political will going to come from this? And furthermore, we believe that it doesn't follow, which was their second contention, it doesn't follow that this peaceful action causes terrorists to feel empowered. Because whom does it cause to feel empowered? First of all, terrorists don't say, oh, well, they're being quiet, let's bomb them more, I hate them more for that, I hate it when people do that. No, that's not why they're bombing them. Moreover, this is why the group that they're talking about doesn't have many support from other Muslim groups, because India has, for a change, and thank God for this change, taken a peaceful route instead of doing the kind of hardline military actions that we've seen them taking towards Pakistan and Pakistani groups for years. So they didn't prove that this is going to legitimize them. In fact, we believe that it's going to legitimize the people who see that India isn't bombing them and isn't bombing the bases, that it's not a two-way conflict, and that, therefore, it cannot be justified. So this brings me to my first contention, which is that this completely violates the sovereignty of Pakistan. Pakistan, first, is a sovereign nation. It is secure in its borders, as recognized by the UN, and as recognized by its own people, finally, after elections that they've fought hard to get. They've successfully held these elections. Moreover, the groups in Kashmir, the groups in other tribal areas, are represented. And so we believe that they have a voice and that we should respect that voice, especially when the UN goes around, when the reason that places like the US bomb terrorists is because we want democracy. And then when a democratic nation says, no, we don't want to use violence, and then another democratic nation says, no, we don't want you to use violence against our citizens, then why do we then say, no, you're both wrong? We think that's wrong. Moreover, sovereignty is needed for international legitimacy. When one nation busts in, when India kicks down the door and says, all right, we're bombing their terrorists, what do you think the United States is going to do and say, all right, well, since India has bombed terrorists in Kashmir, then we're going to go in too and bomb the terrorists in Baluchistan and Waziristan. And we believe that this is wrong, because as soon as you violate the sovereignty of a country, that sovereignty goes out of the window, and it's all they have to protect them from bullies like the US that will take whatever chance they get. I'm speaking personally on this. Moreover, we believe that a government has a right to protect its citizens, that the Kashmir region, the parts that are within Pakistan's jurisdiction, the government has the right to deal with those terrorist groups as they see fit. And we believe that on a matter of principle, that it is not okay to take a democratic government and say, no, we disrespect your wishes, and that we can bust down your doors whenever you want, but you disagree.
Sir, all the strategies that you've outlined for us in today's debate have already used and have failed. It's not enough for you to say that side government strategy is wrong. Rather, your burden is to give us an alternative as to what you want to do with today's debate.
Well, we believe that they've been using the kind of, that they've been retaliating against various terrorist groups with military action for years. And the fact that you haven't give peace a chance to play out, in fact, I think if any country has proven that turning the other cheek works, it's India. And the reason is, I believe that we should continue in the tradition of Mohandas Gandhi, who said that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And we believe that India would be wise to heed the words of their leader. Moving on to my second point, this is going to spark an international war. First of all, when the United States has moved in and tried to take the very same kind of bombings of terrorist groups that they've said, the warning shots were fired at the Black Hawk helicopters. And the US took this as saying, well, no, maybe we shouldn't. So, moreover, when the US, who has smart bombs, who by all counts have a more accurate set of arms than Indians, have already bombed a Pakistani wedding procession, what makes you think that the Indian military isn't going to then bomb civilians, at least one or two by accident? And ma'am, how many dead Pakistani and Kashmiri civilians does it take to start an international war? We believe that whereas the Pakistani government is trying to establish legitimacy, the way that my partner is going to point out, that how long does it take and how long does your policy last until Pakistan fires back and until two nuclear-armed states are in a full-out war against each other because one has decided to not respect the borders and not respect the sovereignty. So whereas India has already decided to take the path of peace, and whereas the other states that have tried using bombs to get rid of terrorists have failed roundly, like we've seen in Israel, like we've seen in the United States. We believe that Pakistan should take a different route. We oppose. Thank you.
703. 703. Thank you, the opposition. I invite the Deputy Prime Minister for the case.
Mr. Chair, in today's debate, opening government is going to be extremely calm, extremely balanced, and extremely reasonable in terms of what we want India to do. Because we believe in looking at this pragmatically as well as in principle. So as much as I admire Gandhi and his principles of non-violent resistance, I think right now, India also has to be pragmatic and look at what is best and what is responsible for them and what's responsible, what will best uphold international security. Mr. Chair, let's look at the things that the leader of opposition brought out and why they're not necessarily the most reasonable and the most realistic route to take. First of all, they told us that this will actually just empower people on the ground in Pakistan and demonize India even more and make them feel bad about India because apparently India is going to be stupid and bomb the wrong places. But then here, let's take a quick review of the Prime Minister's speech because Pauline was particularly clear when she spoke to you about how this will be undertaken by the Indian government who have quite sophisticated intelligence networks who are helped by the European Union and the United States. So we don't think they're going to be bombing, no thank you. We don't think they're going to be bombing random places in Pakistan. We're not going to pay random Indian terrorist groups to undertake this for them. That's what happened with the Pakistani wedding procession we're talking about. This is going to be a legitimate government effort, thus we're not going to be bombing random houses on the street. So we don't think that argument quite flies. But then they said that we'll give the terrorists the moral high ground to say that, see, they're bombing us. Our dads were taken away. But then we think the same burden exists on their side. Because if we don't bomb them, they're going to go on living. And these tiny children of terrorists are going to be enculturated into this culture of becoming terrorists as well. And other terrorists are going to see that it's a legitimate way to get what we want. We bomb them, India continues talking to us. India continues giving us more land. Please, no thank you. Because they tell us, what about the sovereignty? What about territorial integrity of Pakistan? We throw the same question to them. What about territorial? No, thank you. What about territorial integrity of India? Kashmir was originally part of Indian territory. For goodness sake, Pakistan was Indian territory. If Pakistan had the right, no thank you. If Pakistan did what it's done, if terrorist groups actively supported by the Pakistani government is actually doing that, no thank you, to Mumbai, which is, by the way, one of the financial capitals of India, we don't think that's quite in line with protecting India's sovereignty as well. And as Pauline was already quite clear in talking to you about, please, no thank you, there are precedents when you actually, violate sovereignty in favor of actually protecting your own security, in favor of making sure that the international community is stable. Next, they tell us that, well, this is inefficient. Let's be peaceful and non-violent. But then we tell you we've been doing that for most of the past 50 years. What has that done? Not much really, because Pakistan and Pakistan's terrorists just keep on asking for more land that ideologically does must belong to India. If we look at Kashmir and its historical roots in terms of Hindu thought, Hindu culture, we see Pakistan asking for more and more. No thank you. And no thank you. And what India has done is ceded control of that. What has that done to Indian people on the ground? In the same way, it has bred homegrown Indian terrorists who are empowered to take illegitimate action against Pakistan and bomb innocent people in weddings and the like. So we think the more responsible thing to do is for the government, no thank you, is for the government to recognize that it's time to do something beyond sitting in the lotus position and, I don't know, being peaceful and non-violent. Please, no thank you. Because all that's doing is legitimizing the logic used by Pakistani terrorists. Before I go on to the constructive portion of my speech,
What these groups want is a war between India and Pakistan because that's the only way that Kashmir is going to return to Pakistan. You're giving it to them.
Exactly what you're saying. If we allow these groups to go on the way they are, and the groups in India are going to go against them, you're going to have a war fought by two illegitimate, irrational actors who don't really care about things like territorial sovereignty. At least the Indian government is answerable to the international community, to bodies such as the UN, to its intelligence units. These terrorist organizations are not answerable, are not accountable to anyone. They don't have to think about protecting innocent people on the ground. The Indian government, on the other hand, no thank you, has the interest of protecting territorial sovereignty, has the interest of always try to keep their actions reasonable. Something we tell you these terrorist groups don't have to do. No thank you. This is where I bleed into the constructive portion of my speech. When I talk about this third thing I wanted to talk about today, that this is the responsible thing for India to do in light of protecting international security. No thank you. We do agree that it's difficult to sacrifice sovereignty. We do agree that right now Pakistan is recognized as a nation in itself. So what makes us say, okay, let's violate this sovereignty to a certain extent? Because we tell you this terrorist group, Lashkar-e-Taiba, please no thank you, has only grown stronger. In fact, intelligence reports from both India and outside India would tell you that the Pakistani government is actually supporting these groups and helping them grow stronger, please no thank you. And in fact, the actions they have committed have already left India because their ideology is not just to get Kashmir back, it's actually to have a fundamentalist Islamic, no thank you, Islamic rule not only in India but in Russia, China, the United States, and the United Kingdom. No thank you. Such a daring task, we must say. And they have actually carried out attacks in these places. Hence, these groups are actually banned in these countries as well. So we think on the ground, we'd rather quash this group because we do fulfill the criteria for it. And Pakistan isn't doing anything about getting rid of this group. So we think that it's worth making that sacrifice to protect other territories, to protect other nations, because it's dangerous for India, it's dangerous for surrounding countries to have this terrorist group even within Pakistan alone, because borders are extremely porous. As we've seen, these groups do cross borders and do affect other countries, and that's not something that is in the best interest of these countries. There is no way for them to defend that this group must be kept alive, that this group must continue to be supported the way it is supported by the Pakistani government, that it has not only been passively supporting it, but it hasn't even taken any action. In fact, people would say that it's being funded by the Pakistani government. So that's not something we think we can accept in terms of border security, in terms of international security. Because what they're doing is, aside from growing stronger and bombing other groups, they're leading to homegrown terrorist groups with countering ideologies, because these homegrown terrorist groups are dissatisfied with the fact that nothing is being undertaken by governments. We don't want to do that. So on two levels, for two reasons. One, we think they are in principle wrong, and we don't like their counter effect, which is the fact that they empower other groups to take these methods, that they annoy other groups enough to resort to these means. Thank you.
743 or 743. Thank you, the Prime Minister. Deputy Prime Minister, and I invite the Leader of Opposition.
Good morning. The speech I'm going to give you right now is going to go as follows. First, I'm going to refute the points made by the last speaker, and then I'm going to go on to make my new matter, which is that this motion will destabilize an already struggling Pakistani government at the worst possible time, and that is a risk and a harm that we cannot incur, especially when we will not experience the supposed benefits that they provide us with. But moving right into refutation as fast as I can. Actually, in refutation of our points, which were that you're going to be killing civilians with these bombs. You're going to be killing civilians. In this indiscriminate killing of civilians is actually the very thing that begets more terrorists. Violence begets violence. We all know this. So by killing civilians, in addition to maybe a couple terrorists, we say this will actually embolden and justify their extremism. But they say no. India's not stupid. They're not going to go bomb civilians or random houses. And we say, no, you don't need to be stupid to make a mistake. Because if the best military technology in the world, which is that of the US, cannot even avoid civilian casualties, what makes you think that less advanced technology that India possesses will? Bombs don't discriminate the way people do. And whether or not you want to kill those civilians, if you bomb a house that you suspect may have been used as a terrorist hideout, and you kill children, you kill women who had no part in that terrorist activity, that will, I repeat, that will lead to an emboldening of extremists who will actually have yet another justification to rally others to their cause. And we believe that is killing civilians to possibly save civilians is not a trade-off that we think is acceptable. No, I'm refuting your points. So, additionally, they say it's okay to violate and sacrifice sovereignty in order to defend your own citizens. And I think it's a little bit ironic because I'm the American, but they're the ones that sound like George Bush. They're the ones who are saying, well, because there's a chance that our civilians might be harmed, we need to go bomb the enemy. We need to go violate their sovereignty, which is, no. We need to go violate sovereignty in order to protect civilians. This is the exact kind of philosophy that got us into Iraq. Do you agree with that philosophy? I don't think anybody in this room does. But moving on to the more constructive matter is that it would be the responsible thing because we need to protect international security. And this is a small sacrifice of sovereignty. But we respond to this by saying India's sovereignty was not violated by a state. And yet, you want to respond to that by using India to violate Pakistani sovereignty. You want to respond to a horrible act by a state-sponsored horrible act. And we say this is exactly the type of escalation that will lead to war, especially when you have so many parties on both countries just aching for the opportunity, just waiting for the chance to pounce and create further escalation so that they can have their own ends met. We say this is not an acceptable trade-off. This is not responsible. We cannot trade civilian casualties for possibly saving a couple of other civilians. We cannot respond to extremists violating state sovereignty by using another state to violate state sovereignty. This is a disproportionate response that will lead to escalation, which is unacceptable, and that's why we can't pass this motion. But there's also another reason why we can't pass this motion, which is what I will be presenting here today.
Before.
Try it.
Sir, Lashkar-e-Taiba is state-sponsored as well, and this has been confirmed by intelligence from the United Kingdom. So if the danger is as systematic and as widespread as Shabina and I talked about, again, what do you want to do?
Well, if the very problem is that we don't have a stable and a respected and a legitimate Pakistani government that we can actually point to and hold accountable, then your actions will actually create the conditions for this to continue and even get worse, which is actually my entire point, which is what I'm going to bring up now. No, I just responded to your POI. So my contention is that this will continue to destabilize and delegitimize an already struggling Pakistani democracy, which is the last thing we need to do in a place where we need to hold them even more accountable, as they suggest. No. So, for example, how did this government come to power? What was one of the reasons that Musharraf removed himself from power? Because he found such resistance, such antagonism as a product of being viewed as a foreign stooge, as being viewed as unable to stand up to the foreigners who were bombing his country. He was allowing Americans to bomb the areas of Waziristan and Baluchistan. And people said, we're Pakistanis, he's a Pakistani, but he's not defending us. They lost faith, he lost the legitimacy of his government. And therefore what happened? We had this new government come into place, one that was supposed to actually defend the safety of its citizens, defend its sovereignty in a way that the previous government didn't.
Sir.
Nope. So, What if we can see that this policy of allowing foreigners to violate sovereignty, allowing foreigners to violate the safety of Pakistani citizens can actually destabilize and delegitimize a government, then it would be irresponsible to continue the very same exact policies that got us here in the first place. In order for this democracy to gain the respect of its citizens, it needs to stand up for its citizens. It needs to say enough. It needs to say, we recognize that we stand up for our people. We need to recognize that our sovereignty is worth defending too. And the danger of being unable to stand up to the West or to the Indians, unable to defend the safety of its very citizens and fulfill the very most basic responsibility of government. If we allow the government to abdicate and abrogate this most fundamental responsibility, then what happens? Then this government, this democracy, which we all want to succeed, will continue its descent into illegitimacy. Its people will not respect that government. Its people will not view it as a reasonable and respectable actor. This government will not be viewed as an extension, as a representation of its people. And what will happen then? Well, we say what will happen then is that at best, the government will continue to be destabilized. The government will continue to be so illegitimate and be so unaccountable that we will continue to incur the very harms they pretend to protect us against. And that's the best case scenario. But the worst case scenario is that people will view this reattempt at democracy as a failure. They say, well, we tried to change governments in an attempt that they would represent us more, that they would protect us. Maybe if we elected our leaders, they would be able to protect our sovereignty. And if you know what? If you allow this motion to pass, then people will view that as a failure. They say it didn't work. And what's the alternative? The alternative is to go back to a strong man. The alternative is to shift away from a government that has failed and to try another thing. And we say that these dangers are simply unacceptable. We cannot allow for this government to continue to struggle. We say that if we want a Pakistani democracy that can provide the most basic of functions, it can protect the sovereignty of its borders, and it can protect the safety of its people, then we cannot trade that off for the mere possibility that we might kill more terrorists than civilians. That is not something we believe is acceptable, and that is why we cannot favor this motion. We beg you to oppose. Thank you.
713. 713. That ends the first half, and now we need to invite the Honourable Government to open the closing half.
Mr. Speaker, the government identified a clear problem in today's debate in there are cells within Pakistan and outside of the control of the Pakistani government that are continuing to take action against India and continuing to take these terrorist actions. We've had an opposition today who's attacked our model but been unable to show any way they're going to actually deal with these people in the long run. What we want to bring as our extension from closing is an analysis of the facts of why this has to happen now and why the situation is going to become far worse between India and Pakistan if we continue to let these groups go on and if we don't take action now to stop things that are going to happen and what this will lead to in the future. But first I want to look at a few points of rebuttal. But firstly I want to look at the nature of Pakistani sovereignty and what exactly it's playing in here. And the first point of this we want to say is we think that when terrorist actions happen from Pakistan against India, this gives India a legitimate right to take action to defend itself. So we think firstly that India has legitimacy on this point to take action there to defend themselves against these attacks. But secondly, we say that the nature of the sovereignty of Pakistan is that the Pakistani government at the moment doesn't have control of these people, and the Pakistani government can't take action itself against these people. And we think when India is faced with a government that cannot deal with these groups itself and cannot take action against them, this again legitimizes India taking action against these groups. And furthermore, it's important to remember that this is India taking action against terrorist cells which are outside the government, not India taking action against, not India taking action against Pakistan itself or usurping the Pakistani government as such. We think the important fact here is that Pakistan's government can't take action against these cells, and that's why India has a right to. The Secondly, I want to look at why this is going to, will this create more terrorists in the long run or not? And firstly, we say there's a need for action to be taken now. It's not good enough to say, in a defence to this motion, that what all this is going to do is make more terrorists in the long run. What we think that there are terrorists there now, planning attacks now against India, and what we have to do is take an action that will stop these terrorists now. It's an ongoing war against terror, and we don't think it's good enough to say that this is going to create more terrorists without the opposition putting forward a model that deals with the terrorists that are there now. And we say these surgical attacks that can be conducted by India are a method to make sure that these are stopped now. And we think that even if civilians do get harmed in these attacks, which we reject would actually happen because we think that given the nature and geography of the area and the ability for India to conduct these surgical attacks against these areas, but even if civilians were harmed, we think the right of India to defend itself is paramount to that right in today's debate, and we reject that the civilians and all that are going to turn into terrorists in the long run. We think the terrorists are already there, and the risks of creating more terrorists is less than the risk of not acting against the current threat. And finally, we think that what this is going to do with the Pakistani government is not actually destroy it and give it less legitimacy. We think when you have a government that currently clearly doesn't have control of the rebels within its own areas, we think that what happens is when you remove these rebels that it doesn't have control of, it actually gives a new legitimacy to that government. And that's what we want to look at in our positive material today. But before I do,
Okay, so you're saying that they don't have control. When your first team said that they're state-sponsored, which of the two governments should we believe?
The nature of Pakistani politics isn't as simple as to say they're either state-sponsored or they're not. The nature of Pakistani politics is that it's a fractured political system where some areas and some groups of politicians support different areas. And what we want to do within Pakistan is actually empower the moderates within Pakistan and get a parliamentary system within Pakistan that's one that we want. And we say that what the opposition is saying about the government in Pakistan at the moment being the one we want to keep and one we want to entrench is not correct, because when we look at Pakistan at the moment, we see a fractured nature of governments where we have some moderate politicians and some politicians that continue to support these non-state actors in acting against India. And we don't think this is a long-term solution, and we need to take a solution against them. And we think we empower the moderates that are trying to get rid of these non-state actors by getting rid of these non-state actors. We think when you blow up the terrorists, there's no longer a ground for supporting them. And we also think that it is going to give the government a legitimacy within Pakistan, because the government is able to go to its people. We're no longer beholden to these terrorists that we can't control. We're no longer taking non-state actions against India, and we don't think everyone within Pakistan wants to see rogue terrorists taking action against India. We think Pakistanis understand that this is going to put them on a collision course to war with India in the long run. That's what I want to look at now, and why action needs to be taken right now. And we've seen with terrorist attacks in the past, such as ones in 2001, that what happens is India and Pakistan start lining up troops on their borders and preparing for war. And we think that the fact that this hasn't happened in the Mumbai attacks is great, but we don't think this is a long-term solution. We think Indian national pride and protection of their borders is going to lead to war in the long run if we allow this to continue to happen. And we don't think the sort of organic suppression that the opposition is trying to talk about of these terrorist cells within India, within Pakistan, is going to fix this. So we think the end point is going to be war. And I'll take it.
How can moderates like Zardari have any credibility at all if they can't protect their civilians from being bombed by India?
Well, we think they have more credibility then than when they see now that they can't control their own country and the extremists within their own country. And we think that what the people aren't going to see is people bombing Pakistan. We're talking about India bombing rocky regions of Pakistan, hiding terrorist cells. We don't think that's the same as the people of Pakistan seeing India bomb their capital cities or something like that. So we don't think it's as big an infringement there. And what we think is what's going to happen under this model is it stops the collision course that's going to happen. We see that the US also has taken action in the past against Pakistan to attack these terrorist cells. And Obama outlined in some of his presidential debates that he's happy for this to continue if Pakistan can't act against the terrorist cells. So what we think is there's a collision course that Pakistan faces if it allows these groups to continue to act. There's a collision course that's going to make it even worse for the Pakistani people, because what's going to happen is it's going to lead to war, a war that they will probably lose in the long run. We think the Pakistani people are smart enough to see, once the government gains control of its borders again, once the government is no longer beholden to these terrorist groups, that this does actually empower the moderates within Pakistan and allow them to lead the country forward. We think the government that's in there at the moment isn't able to govern in the way we want it to do, and leaving them there and not taking action now isn't a solution to the problem. The opposition haven't been able to provide a cohesive solution to this problem, which we on the government have. Thank you.
Thank you, member of government. Now let's invite the member of opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The closing government said something very interesting, which is they said that these two nations are already aligned essentially on a collision course, and that therefore some kind of swift action is required. We say it's a logic frightfully similar to the one that motivated Lashkar-e-Taiba's attacks within Mumbai. The sense that there is mounting pressure between the two nations, and that some sort of fuse can be reached by mounting violence. What we tell you, however, is that intentional increase in violence is actually what leads to the risk of a war between two states, a risk that far surmounts any risk of terrorism, because it's a very existential risk for the state of Pakistan and for geopolitics as a whole. So as that said, we're going to be looking at two extensions on the closing opposition today. The first one's going to be looking at the nature of the Pakistani state and the nature of the internal dynamics there, because we think we can really flesh out how we think this could flip towards a nuclear risk. Secondly, we're going to look at the nature of Indian terrorism and why we don't think this is actually going to attack the direct causes of internal Indian terrorism. Firstly, I want to very briefly address a few of these rebuttal points, because the first idea we had was this idea of empowering the moderates. And he said, you empower the moderates within Pakistan by getting rid of non-state actors. And we say there are a few fundamental problems with this. The first one is that the model that opening government set up today only gets rid of one non-state actor, which is Lashkar-e-Taiba. It doesn't get rid of the other jihadist groups within Pakistan. It doesn't get rid of the huge popular swell of support for radical Islamist groups within the country. We say that it does nothing to target those groups. We tell you furthermore that it does nothing to actually target Lashkar-e-Taiba, in as far as we're going to be showing in the nature of terrorism, that these groups aren't simply based on one geographic physicality. That they can move, and they can move all the more when the ISI within Pakistan is emboldened to the point of being able to support them, and the military isn't able to resist that support because we see Pakistan being radicalised. We think that's really important that you look at the nature of how this group actually gets emboldened within Pakistan, because we think that the terror camps are not the linchpin of these groups, they're merely an accessory to their acts of terror. But what he told you furthermore is he said there's this idea essentially that right now the Pakistani government lacks credibility. And what we tell you is, if they lack credibility currently, consider how much more that's magnified when the message is that they can't protect their own civilians from their enemy within Pakistan. And what they told you in response was they said, well, but there's so much more of a loss of credibility if they can't control their country. Well, they haven't shown you on this side of the house today that this is going to bolster the Pakistani government's ability to control its country. All they've shown you is that they're going to bomb a couple of targets. Show us anywhere on the analysis on this side of the house how this actually emboldens any internal actor within Pakistan. Because that's what we want to look at now, is this nature of Pakistani state. And it's based on this, their basic presuppositions. They said India has a right to defend itself. And we don't really deny that presupposition. We think, yes, there are some nice concepts of sovereignty, and we'd like to uphold them, and we can. But we say the most important factor in this debate is recognising that, yes, a very nasty terrorist attack did occur in Mumbai, and that it occurred for a number of reasons, and we need to explore those. And we think one of the first basic reasons that it occurred was that we lacked support from the ISI within Pakistan. That essentially the ISI had been allowed to run out of control to a point essentially where it's been propping up these groups and giving them a safe haven in Pakistan. We say, however, that in the wake of Mumbai, we think the ISI is incredibly weak. We think that Lashkar-e-Taiba actually overstepped the kind of general bounds that the ISI allows these groups. We think this has emboldened Zardari, in that we think he actually now has more of a popular mandate to move against this group. We think that you weaken that if you attack Pakistan. You weaken it in terms of the popular backlash that comes next. What we tell you furthermore, that we think is really important, is getting local tribal support to be able to fight this kind of terrorism. We think that's really important when we look at the Northwest Frontier Province, and a kind of acknowledgement that Zardari controls the region, but only in a very tenuous manner. We think that when that's the case, you actually need to get the tribal chieftains on board. We think a lot of these tribal chieftains don't have a deep, abiding belief in these causes. We say a lot of them have been brought up by Al-Qaeda. a lot of its residual Pashtun loyalties within the region. We say that a lot of it is simply revenge against the perceived pro-Western government. We think that these, you can easily buy over these sympathies. I'll accept you at first.
Sir, if you look at the way that you've argued, Mike Mullen, Mr. Speaker, already confirmed that in fact some factions in the state are supporting them, and you're telling me that they're already beyond ISI control. So if they're this unreasonable, if they're this controllable, you merit the response coming from side government, which is stronger and more decisive.
Well, we've already told you, we agree that they are controllable, and so the question is, how do you control these impulses? We don't think you control them by getting rid of control, by sending in a bunch of bombers and exerting all control out of the hands of the Pakistani authorities. Because we say that a bomb is ultimately a remote attack, which has absolutely no ability for continued control from India. If they really think they can eliminate the entire terrorist problem with one bomb, give us any other example of any country in the world where this has ever worked, where you've eliminated a terror group with a bomb or with a couple of bombs. We tell you that what's really important to recognise in this scenario is that essentially you have the ability of these groups to move into cities, to move into different places, to recruit new people, to have a diverse leadership network, because that's how terror cells work. No, thank you, madam. And we haven't seen any analysis of these terror cells on this side of the House today. We tell you that there is a precedent too for finding this kind of tribal support. When we look to places like Iraq, when we look to the sons of Iraq and the Sunni uprising there, we think you can buy over these kind of tribal leaders to oppose the terror groups. No, thank you. What we tell you really important though, based on this analysis, is the risk of some kind of a further war developing. And we tell you this is important right now because we think Zardari is very fragile. We think that there are internal divisions within the PPP. We think that Sharif presents divisions from the National League. We think that the Islamist parties are strengthening. And we think that in this situation, there's a very serious risk that by sending in this kind of aggressive act, you actually embolden, essentially, groups like the ISI would take over. And we say, if the ISI takes over, and even if it just takes over in puppet form, and Zardari becomes a puppet of the ISI, that presents a few really big problems. The first is that it becomes completely immune to international pressure, which we think is one of the huge things holding Pakistan back from using its nuclear option. So insofar as that occurs, we think this is even more likely, given that the US and the EU, under their very model, have sanctioned these attacks, have sanctioned these strikes from India. What we tell you furthermore is we think that this way should give the ISI further range to support other jihadist groups, to destabilise Afghanistan, to destabilise anti-American groups like Al-Qaeda. We say insofar as you create a safe haven within the country, this is exactly what these groups want. And that's the final point we want to close on, is that we think that in carrying out this attack, this was actually exactly what the Lashkar-e-Taiba wanted. We said they wanted fundamentally to destabilise the system, to create a safe haven within Pakistan for the continued existence of their group, and to create a situation in which hugely disproportionate retaliation by Pakistan generated a cross-national war. We say that there's an internal logic to terrorism, which recognises that by the very nature of their scale, they can't destroy India. But by the scale of nuclear weapons, Pakistan can. We say that's what motivates this kind of violence aimed at essentially aggravating irrational emotions. We think that this is exactly what Lashkar-e-Taiba wants, and on these grounds, we're proud to oppose.
704, 704. Thank you, the member of opposition. I now invite the government whip.
Mr. Speaker, we think it was particularly telling in this debate when the closing got up here and described the nature of the Pakistani state, when they talked about the fact that the ISI is supporting terrorist groups, when there is a risk of military control, and lastly, the instability that is currently plaguing the Pakistani state. But what they haven't ever given us on the opposition side is an actual way of dealing with the problem. So we had this kind of late model from the closing half about negotiating with Pashtun chieftains. Well, we think that doesn't actually deal with the root of the problem, Mr. Speaker, and that problem was one that was very clearly set out from opening government, and that is a state that sponsors terrorism. And that's exactly the solution that we've given you, and they've never given you any kind of way of dealing with this problem. And we extended this analysis, Mr. Speaker, by telling you in our extension that the way that you actually go about fighting terror and empowering moderates is actually going about legitimising the Pakistani state through empowering moderates, and precisely the way you do that is through avoiding war, Mr. Speaker, and you strengthen a government that is no longer beholden to terrorists. At the end of today's debate, I want to ask 3 questions. I want to look at firstly the nature of the Pakistani state and terrorism, which was the extension that we just heard from closing, then go on to ask, do we think that this kind of action is legitimate, talking about ideas of sovereignty and the impact that it could have on a weakened Pakistani government? Then lastly looking at what the impact on Pakistan could be and about moderates and extremists. So let's firstly look at the extension that we just heard from closing about the Pakistani state and terrorism. We think that, well, in terms of the nature of terrorism, we've already pretty adequately dealt with that in terms of, yes, we understand it's a self-structure, and that's why our model actually accurately addresses that. I don't think I need to spend too long addressing that. But the main crux of their extension was about the risk of the Pakistani government becoming a puppet of the ISI. We want to say that, firstly, they said that it could create a safe haven. And we think that what Pakistan currently is, Mr. Speaker, is a safe haven for terrorists, where they actually have areas in the north which are completely lawless and which allow these groups to go about committing these kind of atrocities. When you look at the very recent example of the Mumbai bombings, that is a very, very clear, demonstrable example of the Pakistani government being completely unable to actually combat terror in this region, and a clear example of these groups actually strengthening. So what you can see is that Pakistan is already currently a safe haven for these terrorists, and they've never given us a way of actually addressing this problem. Then they told us that we're actually going to be emboldening terror, and again, Mr. Speaker, I think that's precisely what's happening now, and the analysis that we've consistently given you on the government bench, because we don't think that we're actually going to empower extremists, and I'm going to tell you that more in my speech later on. We think that we're actually going to be empowering moderates, and that's precisely what we told you in our extension from closing government. So now I want to move on and ask these last 2 questions, but first I'll take opening.
Alright, whereas the pledge that India has passed to not use violence in response to Mumbai is the only thing that's prevented these 2 states from going to war, what legitimacy will India have to negotiate with Pakistan tomorrow if it goes back on this pledge today?
Well, we think that that pledge actually hasn't been that effective from the very outset. We think that India actually does have a lot of legitimacy in terms of negotiation because the fact they're being attacked. We think that actually the most important thing in this debate isn't about what's going to happen tomorrow, Mr. Speaker. It's about India preserving its territorial sovereignty today. But more than that, if we do want to look at a long-term approach, it's exactly the extension that we gave you at closing government, which is what happens in the long term, how do we avoid war, and how do we empower moderates? So now I want to turn to the second question, Mr. Speaker, about do we think that this action is actually legitimate? There's these ideas of sovereignty about a weakened government that we've been hearing throughout today's debate. Well, we think that sovereignty is all well and good, Madam Speaker. We think that there are 3 problems with this. Firstly, that currently under the status quo, Pakistan is completely unable to deal with terrorists and they've given us absolutely no response. We think that firstly, they're unable to exercise control over huge areas of the country, and that's precisely why al-Zadiri told you in the wake of the Mumbai bombings, he said, I will pledge to fight terrorism, and I quote, in my parts of the country. This is a clear example of him acknowledging that he doesn't actually have legitimacy and control over a huge part of the Pakistani state. And we think there are large areas which are actually controlled by local chieftains, areas of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and this is precisely why you need to take action against these kinds of extremist groups. Then what we heard is it's going to be a snowball effect, it's going to set a precedent, there's going to be invasions left, right and centre. We think that invasions aren't considered lightly, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't set a precedent, and that's precisely why we talked about the UN and why we allow these kind of things to occur sometimes. But more than that, they haven't given us a solution to these kind of strengthening cells and the real immediate threat that we've outlined for you on the government bench. And then what we heard is that this is going to have a really clear impact on the Pakistani government. They're weak, it's going to destabilise them, and it's going to illegitimise them. And we think that firstly, this is a government that funds terror, Mr. Speaker. It's a government that, despite these groups being banned, we have Lashkar-e-Taiba actually receiving funding from the state, as the CIA has told us. I think this is precisely the reason why India must take action, because Pakistan currently can't do this. But more than that, it's actually hostile to going about these kind of things. I think the army has a vested interest in not doing this. That's precisely why Pakistan can't take action. We told you that in our extension. We think that when you have this kind of instability, the state actually becomes a breeding ground for terror. No, thank you. And that's why we told you in our extension that that's actually how you go about strengthening governments, and they're no longer beholden to terrorists, and they get some kind of internal legitimacy. And that's, this is how you actually give them some kind of legitimacy. And I'll take closing now if I'd like to take off a point.
Okay.
Yeah.
How exactly is Zardari going to control the tribal areas of Pakistan with the addition of a few bombs from India? Show us that logical link.
Well, we think that what happens is, when you actually remove these kind of terrorist groups, this is exactly the analysis we gave you in our extension, when you remove these kind of groups, what actually occurs is that you no longer have a government that's beholden to these kind of terrorist actions. You get moderates who actually like a government, an area which actually controlled, that's not actually controlled by terrorists. I think there's a groundswell of support within Pakistan currently for these kind of actions to be taken for these kind of terrorists to be removed. When you have that, that's how you empower moderates. This analysis that was very clearly given to you in our extension, Mr. Speaker. But now I want to turn to this last question. What do we think are actually the consequences are going to be for Pakistan? And that's precisely what we just heard in that point of information about empowering moderates or angering extremists. Because what we heard is that the consequence of this kind of action is actually isolating moderates, Mr. Speaker. And we think that firstly, what they actually ignored in terms of this analysis was the terrain that we're talking about the mountainous northern regions. But it's precisely the reason why terrorists go there is because it's inhospitable. But secondly, they ignored the kind of technology that India has the ability to use. But more than that, what they didn't actually acknowledge, when they tried to ignore, was the fact that most Pakistani citizens, Mr. Speaker, don't actually want a government and a country that's being held ransom by terrorists. And we think that when you actually remove these kind of elements, you strengthen the government and empower moderates. But even if we never think that this is a reason not to do this, the fact that it may empower a few extremists who frankly already have a pretty big grievance and are extremists for a reason, we think that it's never a reason to do this. So, Mr. Speaker, because we actually acknowledge what's currently occurring in the Pakistani state, we think this action is legitimate, we think that the consequences of Pakistan are actually incredibly positive, we're very, very proud to propose.
I'm going to do a whip, but now I invite the last speaker in the opposition, option whip.
Mr. Speaker, there's one question to bear in mind when you think about everything the government bench has told you today. And it's a very simple question of what happens next? What happens after India bombs these terrorist camps? Because the first government didn't tell you. They just said it will be a good idea because India's been provoked. And the second government told you that this will magically remove all the terrorists and give Zardari control of the tribal area. They never told you how. So the real question in this debate is what will actually happen next? So this debate falls down into three areas, Mr. Speaker. The nature of terrorism and what the terrorists want and why they did what they did. The second question is, what's the internal politics of Pakistan and what will this government proposal do to those politics? And the final question, which we've been challenged on repeatedly by the government bench and to which Lewis gave a very clear answer, is what will a solution actually look like? So the first question, the nature of terrorism. What we tell you is that terrorism is a self-perpetuating cycle, whereby the terrorists commit an outrage and then the government responds with a further outrage, no thank you, which further motivates new terrorists. That this radicalizes civilians, that this makes people much more likely to want to strap C4 to themselves and blow things up. That's the way terrorism works. The terrorists take a gamble that the government is going to be irrational and overcompensate with its retaliation and thus harm civilians and no thank you and be as unreasonable as the terrorists themselves are. That's the gamble that the terrorists take. What we told you, and what I rose in a point of information to tell them, is that the terrorists want this war. They want India to bomb them, because India will also be bombing civilians when they do this. And what will happen then is that Lashkar-e-Taiba, no thank you, and their allies in the Pakistani intelligence service will be strengthened, and war is more likely, and that's how they're going to achieve their aims. No thank you. What we've been told by the government is that actually the nature of terrorism is that somehow if we bomb them, that will remove them. We tell you absolutely not. We asked them for one single example of where bombing has actually removed terrorists anywhere in the world, any time in history. They singularly failed to give us that example. The reason being, it doesn't exist. So on the nature of terrorism, they've simply failed to understand what's going on here, because the terrorists want them to do what they're proposing. So let's now look at what this will do to the internal politics of Pakistan. Because what they've told us all the way down their line is that these terrorists are state-sponsored. But what they failed to understand, no thank you, even while they've told us that the state is fragmented in Pakistan, is that they're only sponsored by one part of the state. They're sponsored by the intelligence services, who are not necessarily the same as Zardari and his current moderate government. So what we say is that there is a clash within the Pakistani government right now over who's going to be in charge, and I'll take closing.
You're worried about what happens next. What happens next when we don't take action and after the next attack, India reacts even worse?
So what your entire logic is that we're on a collision course right now, so we may as well collide. We don't concede that we have to be on this collision course. We think that the current wise actions of the Indian government are actually keeping these terrorists very far out in a limb because the Indian government hasn't reacted as they bet they would. So they're looking bad. So the ISI is vulnerable right now. So Zardari can show that he's able to manage India-Pakistan tensions. He can show that moderation works, and he can marginalize the ISI. They've taken a risk, it hasn't paid off yet, and what they're telling you is that you should reverse all the progress we've made with the wise policies of the Indian government. No, thank you. But what's worse is that we tell you that Lashkar-e-Taiba and their allies in the intelligence services are much, much more likely to use the nuclear option that Pakistan has at its disposal. And they've never given you an answer to that. Because what we tell you is that a couple of suicide bombers in hotels is nothing like the nightmare scenario that we have when a nuclear exchange takes place in the Indian subcontinent. That is the absolute worst case scenario, and they make it much more likely because they make the extremists and the zealots much more likely to take power in Pakistan. Because if Zardari can't protect his civilians, if he can't guarantee safety to Pakistani civilians from India, then he simply will fall. This nonsense from second government that somehow India bombing Pakistan will strengthen their current government is just absurd. When has a government ever been strengthened by failing to protect its citizens? They once again never gave us an example of that. What we tell you is that if moderation works, then we're much, much closer to a solution, and that we think would be very good. So this leads nicely on to the third area of clash in this debate. What will a solution look like? Not this. And I'll take over.
Sir, you've never responded to the argument coming from us that we'd rather the state, which is accountable to the international community, do this rather than insurgent groups in India which are threatening to respond to Pakistan right now. You can't just tell us what the solution looks like, but what is the solution?
Right. What's the solution? Wonderful. I'm glad you asked. The solution is that we follow the examples of other successful measures to deal with terrorists in the past. We look, for example, particularly to what Lewis told you about our current successes in Iraq, where we've got a very similar situation in terms of tribal leadership, in terms of ethnic loyalties being arguably much more important than radical Islam, in terms of the tribal leaders supporting Al-Qaeda, supporting Lashkar-e-Taiba, supporting the Pakistani intelligence services. We tell you that these people are very tenuously loyal to these crazy ideas of provoking a broader nuclear exchange in the Indian subcontinent, and that they can be bought off if the moderates can provide security and if the moderates can provide a better way of life for them. So what we tell you is that the really pertinent example here is the Sons of Iraq in Iraq, where we started paying Sunni tribes $300 a month, and they switched from supporting Al-Qaeda to supporting the American forces. No, thank you. That's something that we think hasn't been tried yet in Pakistan. It can't be tried in Pakistan if they bomb, and we think it's something that's very likely to work. Moreover, we look at, for example, in Northern Ireland, where moderation on the part of the British government was what finally achieved something close to a solution. What we tell you is that the British government followed their logic for about 30 years, and they kept on ratcheting up the pressure, they kept on making the situation worse, and they kept on radicalizing the population and creating more terrorists. Then they realized that was a stupid idea, and they're a country that has very great experience with this, and then we got peace. What we tell you is that someone has to take the first step for peace. Pakistan can't do that because the ball's in India's court. If India continues to hold to its moderate course, that will marginalize the ISI, it will marginalize the terrorists, they'll look bad, Zardari will look good, he'll show that he can manage India-Pakistan tensions, and we're going to have a much, much better situation in the Indian subcontinent. We're going to have a situation where we can detach these tribes from the ideals of terrorism, where we can detach these tribes from the ideals of bombing Indians. If we do what they say, what happens next? We tell you we strengthen the extremists, we strengthen the chance of a nuclear exchange, which would be infinitely worse than anything they've told us about, and we strengthen the chance of absolute chaos. We are very proud to propose.
Thank you, next speaker. Can you please cross the house? Take a hand. Leave the room, please. Everyone leave the audience.
Oh, that's a big room.
Go.
You go.
I sometimes ask myself, but what's your real intention? As loudly as you like, sir.
I ask you. Oh, shall I give them the result? My word.
By all means, you'll be the one that dies. Back, cycle, sorry. Back, we're going to have a discussion now. Cycle. They can sit at the back, no worries. Tuna, these children can stay, but everybody else has got to go. Children can stay. Dad, can you close the door? So send one of your entourage. Do. two arguments were about the same.
Yes.
It's about like how this is a real situation. I like the Labour last speech, and it was good, very solid, very well. That's right. Second speaker, that we are off. That was a little bit. Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. But Leader opposition, I've got written down here, you know, what she was talking about. Now you want to walk, you know, that was one of the questions. Now you want to walk between India and Pakistan. And she said, you know, India should, you know, is responsible for the international community. Well, the international community don't condemn war between India. It begins to, you know, the logic is just not happening. And then she really got, I think when she talked about the stuff later on about, you know, Pakistani government's helping them, what's fundamental Islamic rule everywhere, and then to say later on, but the people of Pakistan don't want this. I think, you know, in the second half, also the ninth, the first, a little bit.
The Prime Minister actually was too focused purely on, you know, fundamentals of India itself to actually protect itself without actually considering other, you know, other factors in the situation as a whole. When actually the opposition actually united them in the war of India actually made occurring about, you know, bombs and stop terrorists, etc. That's still the international principles of war.
Yeah.
Because the international principles is like collateral, right? Because the European was actually focused on, you know, these people ideally has to go to, they want to go in at the Islamic rule, they want the India should be protected, some of that stuff. And I was like,
That characterization was a bit.
It was too narrowed down, and I really thought, I thought that you actually should actually bring Pakistan into the debate even more better, and that would really solve the case more. But I don't understand why.
See, the other thing is, I think that the opening, they're closing those. You know, where I think the shadow period was, I think that was actually a question by the opening speech on this page, the opening. You know, you say you don't have control, and then you say you state sponsored. Yeah. What do you want? You know, if it's state sponsored, then they have control. Do you know what and I thought that in the response here, you know, okay, well, that's your problem, so I think yours. Because you didn't go. Where was that? And I thought it got a bit bizarre towards the end too. I thought the stuff, the opening on, or the member one, I thought those was good people, you know, bringing this kind of nuclear
Holocaust.
Outcome. I thought that's really good. I'll leave it at that.
I actually like when he actually destroyed the argument actually from closing that from that side, actually saying, you know, the logic was strengthening the government itself, it actually was logical. He actually killed the whole argument into the words. So it's like,
That was the other question I had. What do the government is speech?
It's on tables before.
stupid question.
It's actually be self-contained. It will be self-contained. So more than enough.
We don't get, I don't see a problem with announcing that. You know?
I just want, because I just
We'll-
want it
we'll
for
all-
everyone.
We'll all four be
Yeah, well,
there.
I think you should send something to ask people in the other rooms what they're doing. My suggestion is that it's okay to announce the result now and give them these talkers about it. Yeah? But let's see let's have a common approach. He asked here, what legitimacy is in the government tomorrow if you go back and protest? That's very simple. Didn't respond to that at all. She just went, no. Basically. And then later on, there's this question of closing the government. You know, how is Pakistan going to have more control of a few bombs? Where is the link? You know, and I think that completely exposes that credibility in the closing government.
The nature of terrorists when actually imposing analyzing like the movement, the necessity actually moving around, etc. How to actually know the people location of. I thought that was a good analysis. So you cannot actually ensure that your bomb can actually reach from to the group. That's one level. Second thing I like was actually it's only one group. I mean there's so many groups in Pakistan. How can actually just kill one group and the government and be outside?
Yeah.
Like how it unfolded. That's rather the problem with the opening government of going and narrowing it down. Just one.
I must say, they're very narrow.
So it's a great group, okay, he says, and even if, and they're all there, what about, what about all the other groups?
This is where I like how the closing opposition also brought in all the things they were kind of waiting for, like a place where these training camps are inhospitable, that sort of very remote area.
Northern part,
Sure, they go and set up these camps there because there are.
Neil, have you announced your decision?
No, not announced it. No, also about keeping
Okay. Yeah. But I think Do you think we ought to, when we're ready
If we
to...
get all 4, I think we should announce it as soon as we've got them, just to
I
tell
agree.
them who's through,
I
and then
agree.
we can fiddle around with the pairings at lunch.
I agree.
I just don't know if we'll get all 4. Have you seen? Has anyone else been in with results?
Shaq came in just now and said, what do you want to do? And I basically said, what I want to do is, I'd like to announce it as soon as we can.
Great. Well, let's we could let the chairs announce their results,
Yeah.
and just get everyone back in.
Yeah.
If we get all 4. So we've got 1, 2 at the moment.
Right.
What's yours? Just out of interest. I won't tell anyone.
Vermont Howard.
Oh, that's nice. That's for the Americans. We've got 2 Australians here. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Right.
We had an Ateneo opened up and basically narrowed the topic right down to one particular radical terrorist group that wants to commit non-violent bombs, and then everybody else said, well, that's fucking I nailed that. You know, how do you
Wasn't there only one guy left? That's a very good bomb.
he's got a lot of kids.
Oh dear.
Yeah, so and they didn't really leave the closing team but and then in not going there they developed this bizarre kind of lack of logic saying,
See the problem.
these guys
How to
are
actually
closing
go along with it.
I think they were put in a very, very
They did try.
They tried it, but I didn't think that.
That's a shame. That's a real shame.
Yeah.
I guess they're trying to be clever and say, we're not going to cause widespread spread. People just propose things the way that they just
It's
That's a shame. That's a shame.
I thought, and I thought, oh well, this may be okay. When they started out on this something, I thought, hang on a minute. I have a counterintuitive stuff. No, it was the system.
Oh, right. Actually, they were the team that got lucky in the break. The
Yeah.
room where I got.
Yeah. Oh,
I saw that coming. I was sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right now.
Got it written?
Yeah, come in.
No, you're announcing.
No. So it's.
No, it's like, you go just tell them. Just tell them.
Yeah. When happened? I did this one.
Is this turned off now? It's still.
Actually, it is. I think it
No,
is.
it's not. Is it? Oh.
It's turned off. Thanks, Omar.
It is on. It's
Yeah,
recording.
thanks. Thanks, TJ. That was great.
Thank you all.
Good.
So does
Thanks,
that
Omar.
mean that you,
Fine judging.
Yeah, yeah. Good.
so
Thanks, TJ.
do you get Tuna to remove the deliberations of the tape? Because if it's still recording.
We should. I will ask him to do that.
Actually, that is true.
Yeah, it's inside.
Oh, you're smart. Actually left the room and opened the.
But hang on a minute. What we did was true. What we were saying was right.
Of course.
There was no real.
People always
like-
want to hear the truth.
Yeah, it is like an example of good deliberation.
If there'd been something, no, no.
Then it would have been a bit.
Then it would be. That's when you need to wipe that shit out.
But I think we were.
I just called it.